Orlando Tyve Anderson was born on August 13, 1974, in Compton, California. He was raised by his mother and great-grandmother on the south side area of Compton at his great-grandmother's house. Growing up, he was very close to his family and was always surrounded by aunties, uncles, and grandparents, including his uncle, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, who lived next door. As a young kid, he was described as being charismatic, smart, and very mature for his age. It wasn't until his early teen years that he got involved with gangs, joining the Southside Compton Crips and picking up the nicknames Lando and Baby Lane. Soon after, he began compiling a criminal record that included arrests for assault and robbery, which eventually led him to serve time at a juvenile detention center. But even during his troubled teen years, Anderson continued to go to high school, always passing his exams and earning high grades. He attended Dominguez High School in Compton and also spent a year at Taft Charter High in the San Fernando Valley, a school for high academic achievers and also the same school that rapper Ice Cube went to. After graduating high school, Anderson moved in with his high school sweetheart, Rashina Smith, and the two went on to have 3 children together. He also had 1 daughter from a previous relationship. At the age of 19, Anderson briefly worked at a car hydraulic shop, but his real passion was music and screenwriting. He dreamed of a career in the entertainment business, and by the age of 21, he was busy working with his half-brother on writing a movie script and starting a record label they called Success Records. During this same time, Anderson was also an active Southside Compton Crip gang member who was well known with a reputable name in the streets. As Anderson was busy building a name for himself, Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur were busy enjoying their success at Death Row Records. Suge, who's from Compton's Mob Piru, had put up $1.4 million bail for the release of Tupac from jail, and immediately signed him to a record deal. In 1996, Tupac's album All Eyes on Me was released, and he was the fastest rising star in hip-hop, with the entire Death Row behind him. Suge Knight's Death Row Records, which was made up almost entirely of Compton gang members from Mob Piru, was known to be a record label involved in gang activity. And after Tupac joined Death Row, he quickly took to the role as a Mob Piru gang member. Tupac can be heard on songs yelling out MOB, and would often be seen driving through Compton interacting with other Piru gang members. Even though Tupac had began claiming a different set than where Orlando Anderson was from, Anderson remained a huge Tupac fan and owned all of Tupac's albums. There was never an altercation between Anderson and Tupac until the Las Vegas incident, which had actually been set into motion a month earlier in California. It was August 1996, and Orlando Anderson was shopping at the mall in Lakewood, California, when he spotted Trayvon Trey Lane at a Foot Locker. Trayvon Lane, who was a rapper and associate of Death Row Records, was wearing a gold necklace with the Death Row emblem, a personal gift from Suge Knight, and one that Suge Knight would often give to his Death Row family. As Trayvon Lane and 2 other Pirus were looking at shoes inside Foot Locker, they were approached by Orlando Anderson and a group of Southside Crips. After a brief conversation, Anderson snatched the Death Row chain off of Trayvon Lane's neck and fled the store. Fast forward 3 weeks to September 7th. The Tyson fight had just ended, and crowds were making their way into the lobby of the MGM. Trayvon Lane, who was walking with Tupac at the time, spots Orlando Anderson walking through the crowd wearing the stolen Death Row chain around his neck. Lane points out Orlando Anderson to Tupac, telling Pac that Anderson is the one who took his chain weeks before at the Lakewood Mall. Tupac approaches Anderson and asks, "You from the South?" meaning, are you from the South Side Compton Crips? This question ignited the now famous MGM brawl that included Suge Knight and Tupac's entire entourage jumping Orlando Anderson, who was clearly outnumbered. Immediately after the brawl, Orlando Anderson found his uncle Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, who was also in Las Vegas for the fight. Keefe D. was a well-known OG from Compton, with connections to the streets and the music business. After Orlando explained to his uncle the scene that had just occurred at the MGM, they set out to devise a plan on what their next move would be. Keefe D., who knew Suge Knight personally, had originally wanted to arrange a one-on-one fight between Tupac and Orlando Anderson in response to Anderson being jumped and to squash the beef before it turned into something bigger. Anderson and Keefe D. drove to the 662 Club, the spot where the Tyson fight after party was scheduled to be held. But after waiting in the parking lot for 30 minutes, Tupac and Suge Knight never showed up. Anderson, Keefe D., and 2 others then got into a white Cadillac and went looking for Tupac. Soon they heard a group of girls screaming Tupac's name and saw Suge Knight's black BMW drive by. They made the decision to drive alongside the BMW, where Anderson, who was sitting in the back seat, then leaned over and opened fire. It didn't take long before the rumors started flying in the streets that Orlando Anderson was the one responsible. However, with no clues and no one willing to talk, police made no arrests in the days following the shooting. Orlando Anderson returned home to Compton and attempted to get back to living a normal life. While there were many people who said they heard Anderson bragging about the shooting, he adamantly denied any involvement, hired a lawyer, and did interviews professing his innocence. But the public and the press had already labeled him as the man who killed Tupac, and the police continued to look for any evidence that would prove that fact. A war between the Southside Compton Crips and the Mob Piru had also started because of the Vegas shooting, with waves of violence happening throughout Compton. Many people from both the Southside Compton Crips and Mob Piru were shot, including Orlando Anderson, who was shot in the legs. On the night of October 2nd, 1996, 300 police officers raided the house of known gang members in Compton. The mass raids were part of a crackdown to try and bring an end to the war in Compton, but it also gave Compton police the opportunity to arrest Orlando Anderson. Anderson was arrested during the raids, not for the murder of Tupac, but for an incident earlier the same year that resulted in the death of a man at a party. After Orlando was arrested, Las Vegas detectives and the Compton police questioned him about the Tupac murder, but neither law enforcement agencies were able to turn the circumstantial evidence into something that would make a case, and Anderson was released. During this same time, Suge Knight was going to court for a probation violation for his involvement in the MGM fight and was facing 10 years in prison if convicted. Knight's attorneys reached out to Orlando Anderson, offering him $60,000 to testify on behalf of Suge Knight. Anderson agreed and testified on the stand that Suge Knight was not one of the men that jumped him and was instead trying to stop everyone from fighting. However, even with Anderson's testimony, Suge Knight was still found guilty and sentenced to 9 years in prison. That same year, Anderson filed a lawsuit against Tupac Shakur's estate for compensation for the injuries that he said he received from Tupac during the MGM Las Vegas brawl. By 1998, 2 years after Tupac's death, many people, including Anderson, thought someone might kill him in a revenge attack for Tupac, but it didn't happen. Anderson was quoted as saying in an interview, "I'm not going to worry about it. I can't spend the rest of my life worrying about Tupac." But the rest of Anderson's life would be cut short when just a few months later he was killed in an incident completely unrelated to Tupac's death. It was May 29, 1998, and Anderson's 85-year-old grandmother had just passed away. As members of his family gathered at home, Anderson and a friend went to grab some food. Driving a Chevy Blazer, Anderson pulled into the parking lot of Mom's Burgers in Compton, which was located in a rival gang's neighborhood. Anderson spotted a man at the car wash across the street that he believed owed him money. He confronted the man, things quickly escalated, and a gunfight erupted. 3 out of the 4 men involved were killed in the altercation, including Orlando Anderson, who was 23 years old. The news of Anderson's death created a divide in public opinion, with some labeling his shooting as karma, and others saying it was a common way of the streets and a result of gang life. Later it was released that the lawsuit Anderson filed against the Shakur estate was settled just hours before his death and would have netted him $78,000. After Orlando Anderson's death, things calmed down in Compton, and because Anderson was never officially arrested for Tupac's murder, his involvement in the shooting slowly faded, and numerous conspiracy theories began to circulate. Police continued to investigate and search for evidence that would either confirm Anderson's involvement or implicate someone else, but eventually, Tupac's murder case went cold. That was until 2009, when Orlando Anderson's uncle, Keefe D, found himself in trouble with the police, facing life in prison for drug charges. Keefe D made a deal with detectives under immunity to finally reveal the details of Tupac's murder. In a taped confession, Keefe D admitted to being in the car the night Tupac was killed, and that his nephew Orlando Anderson was indeed the man who fired the shots. In the years since Keefe D's confession tapes, some conspiracy theorists have questioned the validity of his story. But Keefe D stands by his statements, which have helped many Tupac fans make peace with the fact that the questions surrounding the rapper's death can finally be laid to rest. Orlando Anderson himself was laid to rest on June 6, 1998, next to his grandmother, who was buried on the same day. Many will remember Anderson as a young OG from Compton, California, who was a friend, a brother, a father, and a Southside Crip who was taken too soon by street violence. Yet others will simply remember him as the man who killed Tupac Shakur. But whichever way you see it, Orlando Anderson will always be a notable face in California's history.